Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Collaboration Tech with Jonathan Rosenberg. What I'd like to talk to you about today is to understand some of the real threats that exist in SaaS-based communication systems, a bunch of which are actually pretty different than ones you see on-prem. And in later videos, we'll talk about how to mitigate against these threats. So let's jump right in. What are some of the threats you might see in a SaaS-based collaboration system? Well, some of these threats are similar to on-prem. For example, a super common one people worry about is they worry about, here we go, Wi-Fi eavesdropping. What is Wi-Fi eavesdropping? Wi-Fi eavesdropping is this common attack where you're sitting in a internet cafe, you're accessing a collaboration tool from your laptop, and a bad guy snoops on the Wi-Fi and gets access to your information. Okay, that's a threat that we might worry about. Another threat that we worry about is HD theft. That's hard drive theft. So you can imagine that you're using a collaboration SaaS service, and one of the IT guys of your SaaS provider goes and steals a hard drive out of the data center, thus getting access to corporate data that might exist on that hard drive. Okay, that's a problem. Another one is what I like to call accidental data flow. What is accidental data flow? Well, if you're using a SaaS vendor as an enterprise IT guy, one of the problems you run into, and we talked about this in my prior video, is that even though as an IT guy you're consuming services from one SaaS vendor, that SaaS vendor in turn actually licenses and uses cloud services from other SaaS vendors. So a collaboration vendor might actually use a storage vendor or an analytics vendor. And as an IT guy, your data might flow from one to the next, and it might end up in the hands of a vendor that is not very savory or has poor practices, and therefore information is lost. So in some sense, this is not an attack in and of itself, but it leads to other potential attacks. Another attack is very unique to SaaS, and that's intertenant. What is that? So you can imagine that a SaaS vendor is using Amazon.com or Azure or Google Cloud to host their services, and a different tenant is existing in Amazon, and they're a bad guy. And what they do is they use some defect or flaw in some of the protections that exist in these hosting providers, and they actually get insider access to servers or data or infrastructure through a virtual router or switch that perhaps is allowing the traffic to flow when it otherwise might not. And this is a real attack actually that has happened and caused data compromise to occur within an Amazon instance. So another one is accidental logging. Accidental logging. What is accidental logging? This is the kind of thing that really happens very easily in SaaS-based systems. So in a SaaS-based system, you might have a database that stores the actual messages or files or content, whatever you as the IT guy are using with your SaaS provider. But the data is processed in lots of different places. And the common trend today in SaaS-based services is to use what's called microservices. What are microservices? Microservices are small little bits of software that do some processing in a fairly coarse-grained standalone way. So a particular cloud service might be made up of tens or even hundreds of these microservices, which might not store the data that you give it, but might process it. So for example, a microservice might perform transcoding of a document from a Word file format to a JPEG format, or a microservice might be responsible for fanning out an instant message and sending it to all the recipients before it actually stores it in the database. So problem is that these microservices, although they might not normally do storage, they almost certainly have logging that the developer uses to debug and figure out how the system's working. And you could kind of imagine, whereas Microsoft is not supposed to store user data, a developer might turn on logging and accidentally log some information. So for example, a messaging service that actually just transits the messages, instant messages in a system, might accidentally log the messages and they end up in the log files. And the log files get processed through a logging system that stores them on disk and database. And eventually those logs are viewable and visible by, for example, customer support people. So you can imagine that a customer support guy one day logs into the system, sees an interesting message in the logs and says, ooh, that's interesting, and tweets it. And there you have a data loss. And in this case, it wasn't necessarily through a malicious attacker, but an accident that happens by a software developer combined by sort of a curious support engineer who decided to post something on Twitter. So accidental logging. Another one that's interesting and come up more these days is network taps. So what happens in network taps is that someone goes and actually literally taps a fiber line or an Ethernet cable that is running in the deep bowels of an IP network, perhaps a transit link that's connecting two data centers over which database replication is flowing, and therefore they have effective access to all the information that flows back and forth. Sometimes these attacks aren't necessarily targeted at a particular enterprise, but an enterprise company might get swept up in a larger attack. So for example, honestly, like a malicious government might go and it might install a tap on a line on a big transit link for purposes of some government spying or what have you, and in so doing, they see lots and lots of stuff, including lots of information from an IT or a corporate enterprise, and that information makes its way into the government, and interesting people see the data, and you can see how from there the information might eventually get out. Final one I'll talk about is phishing. Phishing is an attack I think most people are familiar with. An attacker goes and they place a phone call or send an email to someone who works perhaps as a software developer or a customer support engineer or an IT operations guy inside of a SaaS provider, and try and lure them into providing passwords or otherwise getting access to the system. So these are just a few examples of attacks that we can see in SaaS-based systems, some of them unique to SaaS, some of them not. In my next video, I'm going to talk more about the traditional techniques for preventing these types of attacks and compare those. So stay tuned for the next exciting video in Collaboration Tech with Jonathan Rosenberg.